The Leaf Mound Interpretive Trail is sponsored by the Federal Highway Administration, the Georgia Department of Transportation, and the University of West Georgia. Hi, and welcome to another Leaf Mounds Interpretive Trail podcast. If you're following along on the trail, this podcast corresponds to the Rivers, Roads, and I-75 panel. I'm Jennifer Teeter.
And I'm Marcus Toft.
So Marcus, my voice is a little tired today. Do you think you could just read a story or something?
I think I can do that. I actually have a pretty good one right here for you. This is by Archer Butler Holbert. It was written in 1902 in his series Historic Highways of America. Are you ready?
I am.
All right. He writes, "The ancient Indian confederacies which tilled the soil of this continent and built great mounds for defense and worship, so great indeed that the people have even been known as mound builders, undoubtedly first traveled the highest highways of America. With the deterioration of the civilization to which the mound-building Indians belonged, the art of road building became lost, for the great need had passed away. The great Indian trails, covering the land as with a network and leading by the straightest practicable courses to all strategic points, became of momentous importance to the white man when he turned his attention to the interior of the continent."
Hold your horses, Marcus.
Yeah, that's not exactly modern scholarship.
No. Let's take a look back at the history of roads and sort of disprove that little piece of fiction that you just read to us.
Yeah, so I think, Jennifer, it sounds like Holbert is saying that there was mound builder Indians created these roads, and that once that race disappeared, that roads stopped being constructed or improved upon until colonists came to America.
Yeah, there's a sort of dark ages between the mound builders, quote unquote, and the American Indians that the colonists found when they arrived in America.
Right, which is basically wrong on several accounts, I think. He's writing in 1902, so there's probably that element of progress, improving his progress, and so he would see Americans and colonists as improving on these roads that American Indians had built. But that's not really the whole story.
Yeah, from other podcasts we know that there's the Woodland period and the Mississippian period, and at the height of both of those periods there was extensive travel between different cultures in different areas, and while there may have been a quote-unquote arc period between the height of the Woodland period and the height of the Mississippian period, there's still travel going on. And
sure, there had to be. People were still interacting with each other, maybe not on the same level as the height of those periods. And maybe what he's getting at too is that starting in the early 1500s there were Europeans traveling in America, interacting, which, as we know from history, really took a toll on American Indian populations. They started to die off because of the diseases. So, it could be that he's saying that the tribes that were familiar with the Creek and the Cherokee and people like that, there weren't as many American Indians because so many had died. And so maybe it seemed like they weren't improving on these roads because they were not as abundant.
I think also this is sort of a demonstration of Euro-American traditions not correlating, not having something to identify with in the American Indian tradition.
Yeah, right. Like having this author thinking that having roads was very important because they're coming from a European tradition of Roman roads that crisscrossed all over Europe and were kind of a sign of civilization.
We've also seen how their ideas just didn't line up. American Indians thought about things more abstractly, I guess you could say, more symbolically, really. You can see that in their language in treaties. A book we have, Creek Paths and Federal Roads by Angela Pulley Hudson, a 2010 book, a little bit more modern. It talks about how the Creeks used words like straight, clean, or white, and those were words that sort of were peaceful, and then crooked and red, they didn't have the same connotations.
So those words could be applied to a path or a road or a trail, like straight and crooked, those kinds of connotations?
Yeah, there's a cultural resonance that they had for paths and travel with those words. A Tallahassee king said, "We have but one white path, and that path I stand by." So you can sort of see how a path was not just a physical thing, it was also a symbolic thing that their society would have recognized, but Euro-Americans would not have.
Right. The relationship between European Americans, colonists, and American Indians in a lot of ways involves broken treaties. I mean, that's a pretty common trait, I guess, of those relations. So how did roads get started? How did Americans acquire the land to build roads on American Indian property?
Well, like you said, broken treaties. It really started out with the Creeks and the Cherokees had their land, and the Americans had their land. And with the Louisiana Purchase, Americans ended up flanking the American Indians on both sides. At one point, they were like, hey, it'd be really awesome if we could get from point A to point B, which is on the other side of your land.
So we need to go through your land, you being the American Indians.
Exactly. And so the Native Americans were like, okay, but just this little bit.
And when they said okay, it was not just you can travel through here, but it was also almost like a treaty or a pact, like you just said with that, the straight path. So, they were thinking okay, we're giving you permission, but you're entering into a treaty or a pact with us.
Yes. So the Americans were like, well, we got this road, but what we really need is just a little bit of land on each side of it so we can monitor it and make sure that everything's okay.
Right, and then eventually that probably branched out, as more settlers move west, more colonists move west, there's more people living there, more
people are traveling on the road.
More people are traveling, living further from the road, so they need connections, to
the road sort of started to spider out, and they started connecting major roads, like in the north part of the territory to the south part, and each time it was just like, oh, we need a little bit more, until eventually it was like, oh, okay, we got all this land, you guys can go live over here.
Right. Don't you think that the roads probably, they did physically divide up the land, and eventually that just kind of pushes out the American Indians who were living there in the first place?
Exactly. That's pretty much exactly what happened.
All right, Jennifer, so far we've talked about roads, kind of the difference in thought behind roads and expansion and how that affected the interaction between colonists and American Indians. But Jennifer, one thing we haven't really even talked about are what were these original roads like, the roads that the American Indians built? Well,
they're not really anything like what we have today. And the American Indians didn't technically build them. Holbert talks about how the mound builders built these great roads, but really it was animals that had built them in the first place. Or not built them, but created them.
Yeah, created or made them. Right, just by walking in the same area over and over to get to food or shelter or water. The animals would create these paths, and then the American Indians would follow these same paths, whether they were hunting or to get to those same resources, food or water or shelter.
They were safer than going out on your own and creating a path. They went through safer territories, provided protection as you were traveling. They knew where to cross water at the lowest point, or they avoided floodplains. They were really just the intuitive path.
Yeah, practical and convenient, not meandering all over the place just because of...
Exactly. It wasn't the scenic path. It was point A to point B.
Which makes sense then for people to follow it, though. So from animals to American Indians, kind of, I guess, I wouldn't really say improving, because that's not really the idea, right?
Expanding upon.
Yeah, and just using them more. And then you have colonists or Europeans coming over, and they start to use the same trails because it makes sense. Instead of, hacking out a path in the forest, you might as well use these trails that already exist.
Exactly. Like when the Spanish came over, De Soto and his men followed American Indian trails into the interior.
Right. And then once the colonists or the colonies get become more settled, you have carriages and horses and kind of, at the time, what would have been modern transportation that are following these same routes, but because of their bigger size, they're going to make the trails themselves wider and bigger and change what they look like.
Yeah, so they were changed by modern technology, which is a theme once the Europeans arrive, up until World War II, pretty much.
Yeah, because even when the colonists are, driving their carriages down these old, basically Indian paths, it's not a paved road that they're driving down. They're just taking advantage of these natural roads.
Right.
So then maybe in the early 20th century to World War II, it kind of remains that way in a lot of places. But then after World War II, I think things change.
Right, like Eisenhower starts the interstate system in America, and so industrial equipment starts to change the landscape and change the path that roads take. They're straighter, less hilly. They can cut through different areas that we didn't go through before because traveling by foot, American Indians wouldn't have gone that way.
Yeah, and something that I like to look for when I drive is, especially like on 75 up in the mountains, like North Georgia, you're driving through this pass and it kind of looks like a mountain on either side. Well, the path you're driving on is not natural, and if you look closely, you can still see where the Department of Transportation, whoever it was, drills down and kind of created that path. They drill down and blow up that area to be able to
you
put
can
the road
see
there.
where the side of the mountain was sheared off so the road could be there.
So with this industrialization, not only are the materials of roads changing and starting to look more like what we're familiar with, but as you mentioned, they're also changing the paths that they take. They don't have to follow these these now less convenient paths. They can create straighter roads.
Right, and as Marcus said, you can look for signs of man or technological advances.
Yeah, altering the landscape, I guess.
You can look for signs of altering the landscape as a sign of this is a modern road, but as you're driving along, you can also look for streams nearby or other natural signs that would suggest that this was actually once a footpath.
Yeah. So that about wraps up this podcast on rivers, roads, and I-75.
And if you'd like to know more about creek paths and federal roads, you can check out the book by that name by Angela Pulley Hudson.
All right, as always, thanks for listening.
The Leek Mounds Interpretive Trail project was done in partnership with the City of Cartersville and Bartow County. Music by Tommy Wildcat.